We're gonna get this training started. Thank you so much for being here today, and happy Thursday. My name is Katie Collins. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior program manager with Health Resources in Action and with the Community Health Training Institute. And today we are excited to offer a training from one of our partners, Barry Keppard from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and we're going to focus on asset-based planning and resiliency. Today's training, as all trainings through CHTI, it is offered through our Community Health Training Institute, which is funded by the Department of Public Health and is brought to you in partnership between DPH and HRIA. If you've been with us before, you know that at the end of our trainings, we have a feedback form that Victoria will drop in the chat. So please take 3 to 5 minutes if you can before you head out to fill out that feedback form. It helps us to continue strengthening and innovating on our trainings and bringing you content that you're interested in. And we also have a live captioner with us today. So if you are interested in seeing the live captions come up, click Show Captions on your toolbar. If you don't see that button, you can click on the More button and then the Captions button, and that should enable you to see them. If you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to Victoria or myself. We're here to support. And I think that's it from me. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Barry to head into all of the excellent content.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Katie and Victoria, for your support for being here today too. And really appreciate the folks who were able to share their time today too. So once again, my name is Barry Keppard. I'm the Director of Public Health at an organization called the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC. We're one of the 13 regional planning agencies that work across Massachusetts too. So we're serving the greater Boston portions of Eastern Massachusetts. If you haven't ever connected, it's definitely worth trying to find out and connect with your regional planning agency, no matter where you are in the state. Just to get us all started, was going to ask if folks don't mind, if you could just drop in the chat right now to your name, could be first name, could be full name, where you're joining us from today, and that could be the place, the organization, the space that you're in. And just one thought about something you value about the neighborhood you grew up in. So name, where you're joining us from, and something you value about the neighborhood where you grew up. We'll give that a sec, and I'll do it myself as well too. So we're seeing walkability, connection with neighbors, uh, shoreline. So again, the nature connection, a water connection, uh, neighbors looking out for one another. Yeah, the natural environment, the outdoors. Uh, Run across the street and play with friends. So can just shoot right out the front door and catch up with folks that you knew. Being close to family, right? Like living in a neighborhood that you knew people, you had relatives. This is wonderful. Thanks for being willing to drop those notes in there and to introduce yourselves to the group today. I'm going to go to the next slide. Here's a quick overview of what we'll go through today too. That was our welcome. I'll do a little framing up front as well too, as well as another activity for us all to kind of get warmed up and engaged with the topic. Provide a little bit of a foundation on asset-based approaches. I would imagine some folks are coming in, if not all of you are coming in with some knowledge of this approach. So we'll touch on that, but definitely want to invite your perspectives. We'll spend a little time in a small group kind of reflecting on what it means to look at some content and think about, is it asset framed? Would we do it differently? Then make that connection between the asset-based approach and both public health and resiliency, the kind of the planning and the resiliency piece. A little more time for us to kind of connect and reflect, particularly within the context of our work, and then we'll wrap up today. So that's essentially the path that we'll be on today. But as I mentioned, before we get immediately into the framing, I wanted to do another exercise with folks to get some thinking, get some thoughts that you might have in mind in the context in which you work. So I think we'll go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, maybe I will do the framing. Lost my place there too. So just framing up for today too, a bit of what I hope you see that we'll be answering in the presentation and the training today is what does it mean to lead with what a community has rather than what it lacks? And what implications does this have for community health, for the planning side of it, as well as for the kind of concept of resiliency, particularly in the concept of kind of climate change and conditions we're experiencing. And I intentionally use this picture too, because I think sometimes we'll look at a glass and say, is it half full? Is it half empty? But in truth, it's both. And that's a really kind of important thing and something we'll come back to as we go through this today too. So I think we'll go to the next slide, which will give us the activity. Want to ask that you think of a community where you do your work. That may be where you're situated. It might be a community that you work with. It might be a community that you serve. I want you to write down 5 words that come to mind about that community. And what Katie's going to do is share a link where once you write down those words, you can share them, and we're just going to generate a word cloud to see what words essentially are coming up for people. So again, think of a community where you do your work, and you can see the link in the chat right now. I want you to be able to kind of either write down or share through that link 5 words that come up about that community where you do your work.
Would you like me to throw it up as words are coming on? Is that
That'd
okay?
be great. Yeah, thank you, Katie.
Yeah. Are you all seeing my screen?
Good here.
Great.
We're seeing terms around diversity, resilience, places of unfairness and unequal access, um, characteristics like loving, hardworking, but also experiences people might have like being food insecure, challenged or under-resourced, people that are civic minded. So thinking about the city or town that they live in and being involved in functions. But yeah, diverse really showing up as a really, really term that a lot of people seem to be dropping about their communities. It was really wonderful. Um, Get some characteristics too about like retirees, characteristics of the neighborhood, bike lanes that we see in here as well too. But also places too, again, could be a strength, could be something else that we look at and we say homogeneous, siloed, so maybe characteristics of maybe where things aren't working together or not kind of communicating enough with each other. This is really wonderful. Um, Thank you everybody for helping us populate that part of it too. And you'll see, I think, throughout the rest of the presentation, when we use and think about kind of the asset frame or an asset-based approach, how language and essentially maybe how we kind of communicate and identify things is really, really important within that approach too. So thanks for setting us up for a good conversation to come, but also the content that I'm going to share as we move back into the slides. Thanks again, Katie, for doing that. Oh, and a picture in the chat too. That's awesome. We can go to the next slide. So I just want to start in that same way that we were just using language with a couple of images too. And I think sometimes when we see images like this, maybe a predominant story can come through that image and potentially shadow or not reveal other aspects of what we're seeing there too. And again, I'm just sharing kind of my reflections on this too, but the photo on the left where we see essentially kind of a vacant potentially abandoned home or kind of boarded up homes compared to the one on the right, where essentially it looks like it's newly built. It's potentially a place that is essentially doesn't have a lot of litter, or might be a place too where people can be really active. In both cases, we can essentially say one might be looking at essentially kind of more negative light, one in a more positive light, but often present in both are both things that might be essentially things that are considered maybe a deficit or a challenge or a need, but also very likely that there are things that are assets or kind of strengths to that particular place as well too. And when we see images like this, it can begin to tell us and potentially help us take us to a place where essentially it can characterize everything in that place as one way or another. We can go to the next slide. And so when we're coming to the asset-based approach today too, it proposes that we can shift the focus from deficits to strengths. That idea that essentially we're not essentially seeing one lens or another lens, but we're looking for a place where you can kind of make a shift so that we're seeing something a bit more holistically. That the asset-based approach really challenges a tendency sometimes we get, sometimes in the public sector, sometimes in community service, sometimes in the way we look at funding, that we're always looking for kind of needs and a way to understand the needs of a particular place. And even that approach specifically to do kind of a needs-based survey. And really, it then really says, how might we redefine the role and relationship of institutions? I think from descriptions people share with themselves, a lot of people like myself are coming from a public agency, a service organization, an institution. And what does it mean really for us to be in relation with those places when we use or kind of bring into the work we do an asset-based approach? We'll go one more slide. The other aspects of it too is that when we start talking about an asset-based approach, we're trying to think about moving away from thinking about that there's only one way to go about things, and that means just addressing problems, and often addressing problems at an individual level. And it asks us this question about what does the place, what does the community, and what does it mean to have a system where that is the aspect that's changing and where it is really emphasizing and supporting the assets that exist in that particular place. The asset frame is also another one too that eventually has us think about where can we really be sure that we're starting with and trying to stay with relational capital over transactional engagements. Maybe we face limitations in our work where essentially the emphasis or the preference is to have those transactional relationships, see someone as a client, see someone as a patient, see someone as who that kind of service is being delivered to in return for some type of other kind of compensation or a place of essentially getting that return. And the asset-based approach asks that question of, can we kind of break out of that way that we're connecting with one another so that what we see each other is kind of within the same community, or as something of what we're exchanging is beyond essentially just this idea of kind of capital or resource, but a place where we're doing that in a way that it's kind of really energizing us both and building something that can come from that relationship that exists in the work that we're doing together. Go to the next slide. So really, when I say all this isn't to say that essentially the asset-based approach is saying it's time to put on rose-colored glasses. It's a time to essentially just look at what's shiny and don't look at essentially where there are things, where there are real challenges, particularly challenges that are being put on a particular place or a community from the systems, from the policies, from historical practices in a particular place. It is definitely not endorsing that. What it is saying is how might we begin to pull up and look for assets so that we can rebalance that view. And so when you think back to those images that I shared initially, I think when we look at that place where essentially it's a vacant, it's a boarded, maybe abandoned home, is it in a place where it exists that essentially like only what we're seeing is a need and a deficit? But maybe there's also a place when we look at it, can we think about what might we be missing and how are we not making connections to assets in that place that really can be a strength to if we want to change, if we want it to be different, if we want something to kind of go about occurring that maybe otherwise we wouldn't see as a possibility if we're only looking at in the deficit frame. One more slide. So when we do this, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about where this work kind of emerged from as part of all this too. So one source of thinking about asset-based approaches emerged on observations that people were making about work. I think particularly work that was happening in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s about whether or not the way organizations, for example, the way human service work may have been happening, in doing that work, were there kind of risks that were happening in places because those services were potentially weakening or replacing what may have existed. And some of the things that it could have been weakening or replacing, or what people were observing, was that there were these really wonderful informal networks of care and aid, something I think we saw emerge again, I think maybe during the pandemic. But there were these informal networks where someone wasn't necessarily kind of doing it as a job, but someone was doing it, I think, to connect back to what people said because they were neighbors, because they shared community, because they were in that kind of place together as part of it too. And so if someone needed to be checked up on or someone needed something part of it too, were we potentially in a broader community way beginning to degrade that in the way we thought about kind of a need-based service delivery too? At the same time, in doing that work, how important it is for us to be in community and relationship to one another too. And so as that work was being delivered, were we actually seeing relationships lose their strength within particular communities, within particular places, because there was this intervention happening in a way that was like a service provider and an individual, not people who were in shared community with one another too. And so this observation was, is there being something risked? Are we losing something in kind of the relational aspect that exists when people did this, from offering their strengths and meeting each other where those kind of needs were? And then lastly, in doing all this too, could there actually be some happening affects essentially how people feel in a kind of trusted way, in a way that they are willing or can offer what they have. So essentially that capital, that human capital that they have themselves, was also some of that being weakened by some of this work that was happening too. And so this idea is like, could essentially these ideas where support is coming in not necessarily just be a place of support and complementing, but could it be kind of replacing and degrading the assets in that particular place? At the same time, and I think this is something maybe folks on the call have struggled with, I know sometimes I struggled with this as well too, is whether or not that kind of service that might be offered or trying to meet a need is economically incentivized too. So are we setting up systems, programs, investments essentially to invent and kind of incentivize that ability to keep doing that same thing and providing that same service because it has an economic value to the organizations, to the providers themselves too. And so this beginning to question of like, is there something again that's permutating what was meant to be a place of kind of asset and support to something that becomes almost like a function. So it plays back into that earlier concept of kind of that transactional relationship that can begin to exist. We'll go to the next slide. And in the same way too, it began to also ask this question of when we think about community development, when we think about the way a neighborhood or other things evolve, is what's happening is essentially that it's an outside in work that's happening rather than kind of an inside out perspective too. And so are the folks of that place, are those who are involved in these issues, the ones that are driving, owning, and kind of lifting up places of development, and whether it's change or whether it's kind of protection and preservation, is that essentially being hurt as well too, because it's this outside force that's coming in to do that particular part of it. And whether or not the goals that were driving that outside support were actually reflective of essentially that kind of community driven aspect of where people want to go. Do they see changes that are happening in those particular places as like, I asked for that, that is something I saw, as opposed to this is something that has been brought here and imposed upon us too. And so the asset-based approach began to ask all those questions about, is something happening that we need to be worried about? Because what we did before is actually being degraded and we're losing those strengths, those assets that existed around some of those things. And so there's a lot of folks in research have done work around asset, but just wanted to offer this as some of that basis for the questions and the concepts today. So really the question then becomes to come out within this work, if we continue to do some of this kind of service work, or we think about not overlooking or ignoring the needs that exist and being there as kind of a part of a work, but again, whether as an organization or an individual, how might we begin to explore the assets that exist in the place? Come back to that thinking, come back to those potential unintended effects that could have in it. How do we kind of build that in and work differently? And so I hope through the rest of today, provide you both kind of examples, but also ways that may be helpful to kind of think about that. That said, before I go to the next slide, I just want to say you all are assets to this meeting. So thank you for showing up the way you have to. And I just want to encourage you, if you have experience, if you have thoughts, if you have questions, please use the chat to offer that too, because while I might be presenting today, we're all bringing a lot of experience and knowledge and just want to invite that because I'm sure there's other folks on this session that could really benefit from what you have to share. So please don't hesitate. If you have thoughts, reflections, please use the chat to offer them as we kind of go along here too. We'll go to the next slide.
Would you mind slowing down just a bit?
Yep, thanks. I was wondering if I was getting too fast. Thank you for asking. I'll take a drink. Maybe to keep everybody engaged as well too, you should have in the middle of your Zoom screen a little react button too. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about asset mapping. Could you use the thumbs up reaction if you've heard of or have done asset mapping before? Wonderful. Thanks. That seems like most, if not everybody. So some significant thumbs up. So thank you for that. Again, same type of thing I want to invite in as I go along here to your thoughts or experiences. Please feel free to drop them in the chat as well too. But at answering that question of how do we explore and rediscover assets, one method that's been used quite prominently and I think quite impactfully by a lot of organizations is asset mapping. Asset maps are essentially meant to be an inventory of community strengths. So that idea where you can both identify, locate, and name what are those strengths in a particular place. It's a method that looks to recognize resources that might exist, and so whether or not that's materials, information, other things that might be a place to recognize capacities, essentially where people have room, where they have skills, where they have space, and then really strengths. So things that might be inherent in that particular place. I think somebody noted the coastline earlier too. Maybe that access, or people noted it about nature, and maybe it's that access to nature that exists in a particular place. Right? So what are those strengths and assets in that community? And the asset map aims at getting a place where we can kind of begin to talk about those and have those in mind. Typically in asset mapping, there are three categories that things tend to fall in. But as you go through and learn about the approach, and I'd be interested if others have other frameworks, there's usually three categories that end up essentially getting identified in there. One is recognizing individuals. And so learning about, inviting in, identifying folks who offer essentially a certain kind of potential skill, knowledge, access, wisdom, method or tool, but like where do individuals hold that strength? It also then includes local associations and informal networks too. So where are those places where people convene, get together, whether it's based on shared identity, shared interest, shared essentially kind of action that people like to take, where does that happen? But also where are some of those informal networks where we know people are kind of connecting with each other too? Is it a particular space where we know people bring their children? Is it another space too where we know people tend to convene because they share love of a certain thing too? But where do some of those informal networks exist? And then it also then to think about where are the formal institutions, schools, libraries, businesses, maybe some of those kind of buildings that have a known identity, or those places where essentially a certain service or support emanates out of too. And so those are the three categories that often show up within an asset map, with kind of where you start with and hopefully what you're including in that asset map. And this was just a visual I wanted to include where sometimes what could that spectrum and universe of assets look like? And you can see here kind of that same structure of organization, starting at the top in the triangle, organizations, coming down to associations, coming down to individuals. And on the left, you get some suggestions or prompts around what it is that people might have or offer. What are those strengths? What are those assets? sometimes within the asset field to use the term of gifts. What does somebody have to offer? And you can see that on the left side of whether or not be access or services, power, knowledge, the ability to organize groups of people, money. So that part of it, and then who might they be on the right side of that particular aspect of it too? Is it the government that exists in the area too? Is it academic institutions that are present? If you go to the association level too, is it ways people organize either in a professional way or do they get together about, again, maybe a shared geography that they have together? And then ultimately in the middle, who could that be as part of all that too? And so you get a sense here in terms of how you can organize and the type of things that you can identify when you're doing asset mapping. And really, that idea is in answering that question with asset maps, the purpose is to make the invisible visible. And if you think again back to those opening images, if again we're not seeing something in the way we're so used to in a human way to say that's present, how does this asset map help us have those things that maybe we don't see all the time or don't appreciate all the time? So it gives us a way to elevate resources, particularly when we're using a need-based context, because we're often like, what do you need? What is missing? What is the gap? What is essentially the blocker for your problem? We get at all those issues and sometimes miss that piece of saying essentially where is the community wisdom? Where is the organizing capacity that's present? Where are some of these informal networks that essentially are sustaining neighborhoods? Those people who essentially might hold and be able to connect people with information too. And when we talk about this kind of planning connection to asset mapping really helps us reorient to community-driven planning. Thinking back to that outside in or inside out driving force within it too. And as if we use those assets, we're kind of building from those strengths, or at least looking at those strengths in the context of needs that we may also see emerging at the same time too. So it really begins with that idea of people kind of contributing, owning, and feeling like the direction is coming from where the strengths are, not just to replace or address only where the kind of the issues exist within this as well. Go one more slide. And then I wanted to show these two images as well. In my experience with asset mapping, and I'd invite this from others as well too, I think often people can get really held up on how literal they mean by a map in doing the asset mapping too. And so what you'll see on the left is an example where people mapped it by naming those categories, listing those organizations, and having a way to be able to go and look at, again, making that invisible visible as assets for their particular piece. And on the right, you saw a different place where they've decided to, yes, we want to create those categories, but we want to know where they are in our community too. And so it was a much more spatial way to look at what are the assets color coded in this one and where they're located and being to tell some of those stories. And so you can do them for different reasons. And there's a lot, again, ways to do that. There's no right way, but it's that idea is, are you getting at those key concepts of individuals, associations, institutions to really be able to lift up the strengths and see the assets, whether it's on its own or in the context of thinking about needs. I want to emphasize this point too, that asset maps are relational tools. I don't think there's any intention in the proposal of doing asset mapping is that you just sit on the outside or sit removed from that particular place or community that you're looking at and just list assets. Asset mapping is really meant to be a relational tool, something that's participatory. Going back to those earlier principles too of how it's a place of connection in doing kind of asset-based approaches. And really, so if you do this work, it's really intended to be performed with folks in that community so that not only are you lifting up and providing that identification, making those things visible, but you're also furthering those connections among people. Because what if someone didn't know about an informal network or they weren't aware of essentially kind of an association of support? Recently heard a story about some new mothers in a particular neighborhood. Had no idea that there was a mother support group in that particular area. People from that neighborhood knew, but people who moved in that area lacked that knowledge. And so that asset was being missed. And so this idea that in doing it together, it unlocks new connections, and even strengthens existing connections with all those people too. So just really want to emphasize that this isn't just something we do, it's something we're in and we do with. Pardon me. We'll go one more slide. And then I also wanted to lift up this concept. I think sometimes it doesn't show up as much in asset-based approaches, but I think is just important to emphasize too. And it's this concept of bright spots. It's a way of looking at what's happening now and where are those places we're actually seeing progress or success in the way that we would want to see it too, as part of all this too. And what it really says is that in this place that we are, is there already an example of what's working and can be replicated or scaled? And this is a really important question too, because sometimes we'll see places, particularly of a really strong needs-based focus, where we just paint the same picture for an entire place, entire group of people, an entire issue, when in fact there's often variability and differences within that part of it too. And so I'm just drawing an example here. There's a book that I'm a fan of called Switch, from a couple years back, and it tells the story of a researcher who's doing work around malnourishment in Vietnam. And as he was in and with community and looking particularly at children who essentially were experiencing poor nourishment or not enough food, we're noticing that some families had children where that was not happening. And this was a pretty common situation in terms of the town. Like people weren't in a lot of different like economic or different situations. They were all farmers, rice farmers, I think, at the moment too, within this too, and began to have this observation that there's actually some families that essentially where this doesn't malnourishment doesn't seem to be present. And when that was inquired about and learned more about, they actually found that some of those families were essentially including things like sweet potatoes and cooked crabs in the diet, in essentially what the children were eating as part of it too. And so what they were doing was meeting some of the vitamin, protein, some of the other needs that were missing in other people's diets or other people who weren't aware or weren't using that practice. And what they actually did was began to have the neighbors work with other neighbors or other folks within those communities to share those lessons and approaches. And so it really inverted this idea of like, do we solve or try to contribute to solutions of malnourishment by introducing, bringing ideas, sharing all these things? Or do we actually look for what's present and people are already practicing within that community, within that culture or place that can really serve as a strength and help us essentially kind of get potentially to a better place and also essentially be led from that idea coming from the inside, not coming from the outside too. And so just wanted to introduce this topic as well too. So that's going to bring us up to a breakout. And in this breakout, really love for folks essentially to have a chance to introduce themselves because we didn't have that space one-on-one here. But in the breakout, love you to take a little bit of time just to introduce yourself, share any reflections you might have about this background on asset-based framing and approaches. And what you'll see is there will be a link dropped in the chat. And as part of that, you'll be able to kind of go to a set of materials where I really want you to be able to look at some of the examples there. If you can go to the next slide, Victoria. What you'll find on that slide is one slide that's a story, one slide that presents you with some data, and one slide that presents you with a map. We really love essentially as a group if you spend a little bit of time reflecting on those to say, how are they coming across? Is it a needs-based? Is it a deficit? Is it an asset-based approach? And any thoughts you might have on how you might essentially approach that, revise it, complement it by another resource, knowing what you know now, or at least with the information that I shared, the asset-based approach of all that too. So please look for the breakout to pop up. We'll be in there for about 15, 20 minutes, so there's no rush, a chance to kind of connect with one another around this shared topic, and then we'll come back together for some brief reflections and then wrap up with one more section for today too. I'll also say, FJ, thank you for your comment. I'll make sure to kind of read that and have a chance to reflect on that as we come back together as a group. So thanks everybody again in this day and age of Zoom. Thank you for being willing to go into the breakout and actually staying there and coming back to. I know that the button at the bottom where it says leave breakout room versus leave meeting can be very tempting. So thank you for coming on back to the main part of the meeting too. Wanted to create a little bit of space to see if folks have reflections from what you talked about, any aspects that you saw within the examples that you'd have a particular approach to manage, if it was something you had to kind of work on or address. So just wanted to open it up generally at first. Maybe to be more specific, and if you were in room one, is there anybody who wants to just who can share like a thought or reflection from your conversation?
I forget which room I was.
But thanks for talking. Well, Danielle.
Um, I think in the short amount of time we really got to discuss various ways that we have tried to take this approach in recovery services in Massachusetts. It's sort of a natural way that we approach our work. It's oftentimes a bit unusual. Of course, we're looking at needs and other things as well, but just the nature of the principles by which recovery services are designed, it's all strength based and very much always looking at the positive and the forward focus. So that then naturally sort of has framed how we do all our systems work. So I just love really looking at this more as a framework than just a natural thing, like formalizing it a bit more. But the team did share on really different ways in which they've used community engagement to build trust with the community, to get the right information, to learn about the not just formal but informal, and how that played a role in that, and really the importance of peer participatory process to vet. You know, whatever you come up with, wherever system you're in, really ensuring that once you build that trust, that you leverage and kind of go back to the people to see if what you've come up with as a solution or whatever actually resonates. Because we shared examples of where sometimes that's not the case, and you really need to keep that line of communication open. Then what also came up is once you do some type of mapping like this, and then really trying to go through the effort to add the layers of maybe more informal, who maintains, how do you get it out to community, and who maintains the accuracy, sort of being a lift in that once you really start to layer in lots of community-based smaller supports, who keeps this connection going and accuracy of information.
That's awesome. Thank you. It sounds like that was like a really rich conversation too, where
That's
it
good.
shows up almost intrinsically at the work that you do at the kind of the substance use disorder, kind of the support of for people as well too, like at the individual level, pulling out the strengths, how people have done it in community-based processes, but really asking that important question probably, and just borrowing the term infrastructure, but how does that get maintained after essentially you've kind of seen it and know it exists? How do you kind of keep that up to date and kind of share that too? Thanks for all that too. Yeah. Um, from breakout room 2 or room 3, anyone have a thought they'd want to share, a reflection about your conversation?
I'm not sure what group I was in either. We did also have a very rich conversation. We focused on the story and we stayed
Mhm.
there rather than rush through because we went really kind of on a deep dive on that, along with introducing ourselves. And so leaning into the connection versus the transaction. And I think the way I would summarize the story, like what our reflections of the story is that often, we don't tell a full story, right? So people are defined as their problems. Problems are something that need to be solved. You lose when you don't take sort of a strength or asset-based approach, you lose a lot of like the complexity and nuance of the things that we're facing because we want a simple solution. And the simple solution requires that we ignore a bunch of very important things.
Mhm.
So without kind of going too far into it, I would just say that for us, a lot of what we were able to sort of, as we examine the story, we were able to identify traps like saviorism or rugged individualism, a lot of the things that sort of pad or support taking a deficit-based approach and then justify or rationalize why we should take that approach. So I don't know if other folks from my group want to add anything that I've missed, but that's how I would quickly summarize our rich discussion.
Thank you, FJ. Dawn looks like she's on the same page. Thank you for that too. And I think just again naming that piece of both kind of the way that can be a way we can look at and should look at people, but it's also a way that's also used to kind of simplify both for like the problem statement for this idea that we can essentially solve things because it's a simple problem. We have like a one-to-one solution versus the complexity that exists both in people's lives, but in the communities that we're working with too. So thank you very much too. And I think in the next slides, I'm also going to try to maybe answer the question that you put in there, but please come back around if it feels like it's something the group or this piece we can discuss more too. So thank you for your comment as well, FJ too. So just going to take us now into kind of two examples that connect, I think, to the planning side of it and to the resilience side of it too. And the first is, and people probably all have done or involved with some version of a needs assessment too, or been asked to do that as part of funding you received or something you've wanted to do or an organization has wanted to do to potentially understand a community. The example that I'm pulling from here is often what happens within what hospitals have to do, health centers, sometimes public health departments, is the idea of doing a community health needs assessment too. And within these plans, I think often, at least my experience and what I've seen in them is that they really put a lot of emphasis on where there are disparities between health behaviors. So essentially, kind of what people might be doing in terms of smoking or eating or physical activity and the outcomes that they might be experiencing. So are they having chronic diseases, cancer rates, things like that too? And essentially talking about those particular part of it too. And you can see on the right is just an example. Often these plans are accompanied by a view around data in terms of what people's experiences is, and often in a very, very average way. And just to connect to one of the things that was shared on the slide was this idea of like, do we show populations just in a block in a bar chart, or do we actually show them in the variation that exists within different communities as part of it? And so I know I've often found myself, and I think others have as well too, is answering this question of yes, we definitely want to understand disparities where a place may not be enjoying or having the same outcomes or conditions that other places are. But I think back to, I think both kind of Danielle and FJ, what you shared, are we leaving something out? Are we just kind of simplified this to a place of just deficit and problems? And should we also be thinking about something else within the work as well? And so for me, within this example, and we'll go to the next slide, just finding this like difference when essentially maybe we want to do a community health assessment versus a community health needs assessment. And so we're essentially for me, it's a simple change, but it actually kind of opens up a whole world of possibility related to what is comprising communities' health. So both what is lifting it up and strengthening it, as well as essentially what maybe places essentially kind of are disparity. So it gives us that broader frame. I'm going to pause there. Yeah, Emily.
So I've worked on a lot of community health assessments in a lot of different capacities. And, as you mentioned, they're part of for those people that don't know, they're part of the required accreditation process of hospitals and community health planning regional associations and often public health departments. And so they're tasked with coming with developing a community health improvement plan out of these. And so if the charge simplistically is to have a plan of how you're going to address, for lack of a better word, needs or problems, then how does changing this to an asset-based framing lead into kind of the other pieces that are required as part of the community health needs assessment process?
It's a really wonderful question. So like you're given a frame and essentially, or maybe even it's essentially kind of a laid out in policy or law, right? Like this, you look at needs in order to do an improvement plan. I'll tell you my experience in all this too. And the example I have here is from a community health assessment we did with the City of Lynn Public Health Department, was that as much as we identified health priorities, we also throughout that narrative were lifting up essentially what were the assets of that particular place as well too. So we were already laying the groundwork for what might happen in an improvement plan as we were identifying priorities that existed within the community health assessment too. And so we weren't leaving the document in a way to say these are just all the needs that are present or the disparities and priorities. We were actually building that first part of the bridge to the community health improvement plan as part of including that. And I know in my experience, when I read a lot of community health assessments or community health needs assessments, I rarely see that lifted up as part of what has been inventoried. I tend to see a lot of the emphasis on where things are falling below or within a need frame. So I'm sure there's other ways to manage it, but that's the way that we've gone about managing it.
And then do you feel like you came up with solutions and or strategies that were more participatory in their kind of conceptualization than a typical, I mean, again, I don't want to derail your conversation, but
Good.
um, given that I am assuming that the idea, or that somewhere in this process, one of the things that you're going to get to is the idea that like we need to be working with the people who are in these communities on ways in which to create change that is effective and is meaningful for them as well as kind of for the quote unquote decision makers. I'm wondering, if at some point during this presentation you can get to kind of how shifting from to an asset based framing around this might have led very specifically to a solution that was more community generated as opposed to professionally kind of set forth.
Yeah, thank you for that too. I think the next section we'll try to get into a little bit more of that too. But I just want to recognize Heather, and then I'll follow up on your question. Yeah, Heather.
Oh yeah, I think it was just building on what you're already discussing. I was wondering if like that is part of the process of doing the community health assessment and then the health improvement plan, like would you document what progress has been made from the last one and kind of like how the community has contributed to that and what worked and what should be sustained?
Thank you. And coming back to thank you for that question, Heather. And coming back to what Emily was sharing as well too. Often, hopefully in a community health improvement plan, those measures, metrics, essentially kind of signs of progress are getting named with the idea that you're working on some kind of cycle to reassess and kind of reprioritize based on kind of changing conditions. So normally, yes, that will show up. In this particular example I'm showing here, this was the first time the public health department in Lynn had done a community health assessment from that level too. So we didn't have that baseline other than the data that might suggest what the change over time has been around certain conditions within that too. So thank you for that point as well too. Coming back to your question, Emily, and kind of maybe speaking to the slide here as well is I think there were at least kind of three things that happened when we did this. So one, from the conversations that we had, the way people and organizations saw themselves in the health assessment felt really, really powerful. And so it wasn't just somebody who was listed as an interviewee, a focus group member. The organizations that were offering and providing assets in the particular priority areas were already showing up in the community health assessment. So that idea that they were seeing themselves both contributing and in the work and the work that they are trying to do being recognized already within the priority. I think too, and this is a little bit from like the bright spots thinking that I try to bring from, is that the whole idea is sometimes there's this tendency for community health improvement plans or any kind of action plan to say like, you're doing these 50 things, here are 50 more you should be doing in order to make progress on that particular piece too. And I try to, in our planning process, try to live in a world where it's maybe 10 or 12 more things, but where are the things that are going well that we need to kind of double down on or amplify. So that kind of bright spot thinking as part of it too. And I think we're able to carry that forward. And that kind of takes a little bit out, like you don't have to spend all the energy on the chip side because you've captured some of that in the chow side in terms of where you're going as part of all that. And then I think three, it essentially finds a way to hold partnership between kind of the people, the organizations and the institutions, because that is being threaded all the way through the input, the presence, and then those contributions of work and essentially kind of the other contributions people are making from the asset side plays into the chip as well too. And so that's, again, it's often kind of at this point still an experiment on this side, but that's the way we've been trying to kind of manage across those pieces in the way. So don't know if it could work everywhere, but that was definitely what we've tried to do as part of it. I'm going to move us to the next slide too, kind of still in theme of the questions, but also within this topic as well too. This may not be something that you're all working in, but just like the first statement says, climate change is happening and it is affecting all of us, but we know within that, like a lot of other forces, it is not affecting us all equally as part of this too. And increasingly as institutions, as agencies, organizations engage in climate change planning, the term resilience is showing up more and more. If you worked in this field early on, a lot of the focus was on the terms of mitigation and adaptation. How are we preventing essentially the forces that are driving climate change, and how are we adapting to the new conditions? Thank you, Catherine, for being here. So essentially this idea of climate resilience, and often for climate resilience, we'll see this definition. Climate resilience is the ability to prepare for, recover from, and adapt from the impacts of climate change. It kind of just names almost in a very kind of technical way these like three conditions that should happen as part of it too. And so for some, again, if you're working at maybe a higher level, this is a way to look at it. But to this, coming back to this idea of assets, in particular those categories of individuals, associations, institutions, a lot of people probably don't see themselves in this definition, or at least that's been our experience in doing some of the work. So I'm going to go to the next slide. And unfortunately, we got pulled down that path and have had to move away from it. But this is an example of often what people are using to communicate around kind of why we need resilience. It's this idea that we have people who are vulnerable. We have populations that are at risk. We have these terms that are being used that essentially speak to people as if they are only, back to your point of like there's only one dimension to them. And because of that, they essentially kind of face this reek. So if we have hotter periods of days, people only essentially who are like, for example, older, because there may be different issues about perspiration and the way you sense how thirsty you are, or essentially the way you're kind of chronic disease maybe act like that is like it's a risk, right? And that it's often is only kind of what gets named in some of these pieces too. So just like a map you could have looked at in the breakout, it really just shows just like you're vulnerable, right? It almost characterizes people in one way. We've also had the chance, and we can go to the next slide, to participate in an effort called the Healthy Neighborhood Study. And it's a participatory action research project that works across 9 neighborhoods in Eastern Massachusetts. And they were working a lot on similar issues of what's happening in terms of extreme heat, what is happening in terms of the way we can cool our neighborhoods by having more trees and vegetation. But they were essentially presented with information that they themselves collected from fellow residents, plus went on a learning journey around resilience. And this is the definition that they generated themselves. And I think this is speaking a little bit to your question, Emily, and maybe a little bit FJ to your question as well too. So they came up with this definition. It was not one that was imposed on them of this is what resilience is. This is when they thought about the concept of resilience and how they see it within their communities and want it to be both used and perceived. This was essentially the co-design definition that came up with it too. And I'll just read real quick that part of it, which is community resilience is pursuing your chosen path in the face of challenge while acknowledging, absorbing, reflecting, and adapting to change with determination and solidarity, and working to eliminate the sources of harm that require us to be resilient in the first place. At least for me, that was a much more powerful statement about resilience. And then you can see the group essentially said, we really do then need to mean what are the elements within that resilience. And you can see those 4 boxes that talk about it. And they speak much more to the day-to-day lived experience that they have in the context of then what essentially kind of supports resilience as part of all this too. And so from my perspective, this is another way where the assets, the lived experience, the informal connections, the observations that people had from within communities really informed what is the model we should be working from when we think about resilience, as opposed to the one potentially that's being imposed from the outside as part of all that too. We'll go one more slide. And so it's the type of thing I know for me, having been somebody who had essentially, this is a map that you see here is one from MNPC from about 7, 8 years ago, really made me revisit a lot of this information, similar to like what you might be experiencing. Like, what is the asset side of this map? That isn't available. We haven't kind of created that part of it too. How are those assets essentially being captured within these conversations? And how do we do that in a way that involves and generated from community? And what else should be part of this when we think about whether it's at a local or regional scale should be the assets. And so that's a bit of a journey that we're on right now too. And I was sharing with Katie while you're on the breakout is we're working on a project called the Culture of Resilience. We're trying to think about how do we identify and see those kind of cultural histories, cultural knowledge, cultural practices that are strengths, and essentially put a different frame on essentially resilience. So back to that healthy neighborhood study definition. We're going to do one more breakout before we wrap up today. And so I shared those experiences about how we're trying to kind of reform, change that view that we might be bringing to the work that we're doing. we're going to ask you to kind of go into one more breakout, and Victoria can correct me, but they'll be smaller this time too. They're probably in the range of like 2 to 3, but really love for you to be able to use a little bit of space. Hopefully it creates a little bit of time outside of your day to think about within your work, what asset or relationship would you like to build on? What would you need to shift? I think about your question earlier to Danielle, or your reflection earlier, Danielle, maybe it doesn't shift, but like, oh, is there a way to kind of talk about this and have this kind of as maybe a little more kind of in a structured way? What kind of thing would you shift within your practice, your team, or your organization? And what support would you need? And so going to go into ask you to go into breakouts. We'll go for about 10 minutes or so. And then just ask as you go into those breakouts, just to give a chance for everybody to have a chance, just spend a little time going round robin, being able to reflect on those questions too. So you should see breakouts pop up in a second. We'll go for about 10 minutes. So using what Katie shared earlier, we'll go to about 2:54-ish, and then we'll come back and wrap up here today too. So hope you enjoy that. Hope again, it gives you a little bit of space to kind of connect and reflect with others around this. Thanks again all for staying around for that time in the breakouts and coming back as we wrap up. Now, hopefully you found some benefit in both kind of sharing and hearing what others had to share. But again, hopefully that's something kind of gives you a little bit more with your own space, with your own part to kind of continue to take back and use this. And I think throughout this conversation, I think a lot of people are already kind of dealing with this tension. So hopefully it helped kind of unlock your moving forward in a small way as part of it too. So we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to wrap you up with also some resources and welcome others to drop them in the chat if there's ones that have been really helpful to you. But in terms of asset mapping, a resource called the Participatory Asset Mapping, a Community Research Lab Toolkit, something I go to often that I use again for references in today's presentation. If you're someone who works with data and want to do it in a more participatory, inclusive fashion, 2 guides here, the Research for Organizing Toolkit and Dabbling in Data Hands-on Guide. They both offer a lot of activities in terms of kind of collaborative ways to kind of collect, engage, present data. In terms of climate resilience, as Katie mentioned, we'll send these as linked afterwards, but I'll send information from the Healthy Neighborhood Study and the work around their resilience definition. And then on the communications piece, just naming things that I go to often in terms of the Frameworks Institute has done a lot of this kind of work around topics, but also a movement called solutions journalism. So essentially, as we communicate, we're talking more about what is possible, not always just kind of what the problems are. We'll go one more slide. So I just want to say thank you here. I'm going to toss it back, I think, to Victoria and Katie, but I hope questions you came in with, information that you were looking for, again, from the breakout conversations, small pieces that can be helpful in the work you do from being here today, are all things that you leave with. So thank you again very much for sharing your time with me today.
Thank you, Barry. And yeah, thank you everyone for your participation. Yeah, if there's outstanding questions, resources you want shared, please drop it in the chat and we'll make sure to follow up on those questions with you all, and we'll share out any resources and the ones that Barry just showed on the previous slide in a recap email. Victoria is dropping the link to our feedback form in the chat. So if you don't mind filling that out, it takes just a couple minutes and it's super helpful for us. And then wanted to shout out April. We have an upcoming training on website pitfalls, how to distribute your information and how to create impactful content and how to avoid some common mistakes when it comes to management of websites and content and things of that nature. So that's April 15th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. So would love to see you there if that's of interest or would be useful to you all. And then if you all have a job posting, an event, or anything else you would like us to elevate to the larger CHTI community and through our newsletters and on our LinkedIn, please fill out that spotlight form that's on the screen all the way to the left. That is a great way to help spread your information, your news wide to others who might be interested in seeing it. So always want to shout that one out as well. I think That's everything from me. Barry, thank you again so much for all of this information and the helping to kind of bring some of the nuances to light in regards to how we actually apply asset-based planning to our work. Um, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week and a good rest of your Thursday. Uh, stay safe, stay dry. I think there's some rain coming in the next week. And have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks again, all. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Victoria. Thanks, CHTI.